Every Friday for 3 years, the same woman attended a funeral. She never knew the people who died. She never spoke to the families. She simply arrived, sat at the back, cried quietly, left before anyone could ask who she was, and under her seat, every single time, a white envelope. Some families found it. Some
You.
never did. Nobody knew her name.
You were there when my father
Nobody
died.
knew why she came. Until one Friday, everything changed. Drop a comment right now and tell us where in the world you are watching from. And if you are not yet subscribed to Turning Point Tales, hit that subscribe button now. Her name was Naomi Carter. She was 44 years old. She ran a small financial consultancy from a third-floor office in a building with no company name on the door. She had 3 employees, a steady client list, a daughter named Grace who was studying at university 2 hours away and called every Sunday. By any measure, Naomi Carter had a good life. A life she had built from absolute nothing. 22 years ago, Naomi Carter had nothing, not a figure of speech, literally nothing. Her husband James had been sick for 8 months before the doctors understood what was wrong. By the time they understood, there was nothing left to do except manage what was coming. James died on a Friday morning in October. Naomi was 22 years old. Their daughter Grace was 11 days old. At the hospital, they were kind. The nurses were kind. The doctor who delivered the news was kind. Kindness was not what she needed. She needed money. James had no life insurance. They had borrowed to get through the 8 months when he could not work. They had borrowed from family, from friends, from one organization that charged interest that Naomi had not fully understood when she signed the forms. When James died, the debt did not die with him. It waited, patient and indifferent. She went from office to office in the weeks after, family first. What little they had was already given, friends. Some gave what they could. It was not enough. Organizations. She sat in waiting rooms with Grace strapped to her chest, filling in forms she did not have the documents for because the documents were in James's name, and James was gone. Everyone was sorry. Nobody could help. On the 4th day after the funeral, she was sitting on a bench outside a grocery store. Grace was asleep against her chest. Naomi had not eaten since the morning before. She was not crying. She was past crying. She was looking at the pavement and making a calculation about which debt to call first, and what to say when she called, and whether any combination of words could make a creditor wait another week. A man sat down beside her. She did not look up. He did not say anything. After a moment, he reached into his jacket pocket, took out an envelope, set it on the bench between them. Then he stood up and walked away. She looked at the envelope, picked it up. Inside was money, more than she had seen in one place since James went into the hospital, enough to clear the most urgent debt, enough to pay 2 months of rent, enough to buy food. She stood up. She turned around. The man was gone. She looked up and down the street. He was simply gone. She stood on that pavement with Grace asleep against her chest and the envelope in her hand, and she cried. Not from sadness, from the specific relief of someone who has been holding a weight so heavy for so long that when it finally lifts, the body does not know what to do except release everything it has been storing. She cried for 10 minutes. Then she wiped her face, picked up her bag, and walked home. She never learned his name. The weeks after were still hard, but survivable. The envelope had bought her time, and time was what she needed to get back to her feet. She had been halfway through a qualification in accounting when James got sick. She went back. It took 2 more years working nights and weekends with Grace in a second-hand crib beside her desk. She qualified. got a job, a modest one at first, then better. By Grace's 5th birthday, they were not just surviving, they were building. By Grace's 10th birthday, Naomi had her own small practice. 3 clients, then 10, then 20. She never forgot the bench. She never forgot the man. She thought about him in the specific way you think about someone who changed the direction of your life before you even knew the direction had changed. She thought about him on the days when things were hard. She thought about him on the days when things were good, and she wanted to tell someone that the good was possible, in part because of one morning on one bench when a stranger made a decision that cost him something and gave it to her. When Grace was 1 year old, Naomi made a promise. She said it out loud, alone in the kitchen, Grace asleep in the next room. She said, "When I have enough, I will find the families standing where I stood, and I will make sure they know someone is there." She did not have enough for many years, but she did not forget. She started the Fridays when Grace was 16, not with fanfare, not with a plan she had drawn up carefully. She had read an obituary in a local paper about a man who had died suddenly, leaving a wife and 3 children and a small business that was not going to survive. She read it 3 times. Then she called the paper, asked where the funeral was. She went. She sat at the back. She watched the family at the front, the wife holding herself together with the specific composure of someone who has not yet understood the full shape of what is coming. Naomi knew that composure. She had worn it herself. After the service, she placed an envelope under her seat. She had spent 3 evenings researching the family's situation, the business debts, the mortgage, the children's school fees. The envelope contained exactly what she had calculated would address the most urgent thing. She did not put her name on it, because he had not put his name on it. She walked out. It felt like the right thing. It felt like a conversation she had been trying to have for 16 years with someone she could not find. She went back the following Friday. Different family, different church, same back row, same white envelope. Daniel Osei was 26 years old and 3 months into his first real journalism job when he saw her the first time. He was covering the funeral of a local community figure, a school principal who had taught in the same neighborhood for 30 years. The church was full. He noticed Naomi because she was alone. Everyone else at that service was with someone. A hand held, a shoulder touched, the natural clustering of people who share a grief. She sat at the back, crying without sound, alone. He thought nothing of it. He saw her again 2 weeks later. Different funeral, different church, same woman, same seat, same quiet tears, same white envelope he noticed this time when she stood to leave. He told himself it was coincidence. The 3rd time he saw her, he stopped telling himself that. He started going to funerals deliberately, not to report, to watch. He kept a small notebook. Over 5 months, he documented 11 funerals. She attended 8 of them. Same pattern every time. Arrives alone, sits at the back, never speaks to anyone, never signs the condolence book, leaves the envelope under the seat, walks out before the reception begins. He tried to follow her twice, lost her both times in the post-funeral crowd. On a cold November morning, he finally kept up. She walked 6 blocks from the church to a small, unremarkable office building, 3rd floor, a door with no company name. He waited outside for 40 minutes. When she came back out, he was still there. She stopped, looked at him. He said, "I have seen you at 11 funerals in 5 months. She said nothing. He said, "I am not going to write about you without your permission. I just want to understand." She looked at him for a long time, not with fear, with the expression of someone who has been found in a way they half expected and is deciding how to respond to it. She said, "Come back on Monday. I will tell you what I can." He went back on Monday. The office was small. One desk, one filing cabinet, one laptop, and on the wall, photographs. Not family photographs, 14 photographs of strangers, each one with a small handwritten note beneath it, names, dates, amounts. He looked at the wall for a long time. Then he turned to the woman sitting across from him, and she told him everything. She told him about James, about the 8 months, about the bench, about the envelope, about the man whose face she had memorized in the 30 seconds before he walked away. She told him about the qualification, about Grace, about the promise she made in the kitchen when Grace was 1 year old. She told him about the first Friday, about the school principal's wife, about the 3 evenings of research before she could calculate the right amount. She told him that she had attended 142 funerals in 3 years. She had left an envelope at every one. Not every envelope had been found. She did not mind. She said, "If it helps even one person the way that envelope helped me, one day, on one bench, then it is worth every Friday I have given to it." Daniel sat with his notebook open. He had not written a single word. She looked at the notebook, said, "Are you going to write about this?" He said, "I do not know yet." She said, "If you do, leave my name out." She looked at the wall. She said, "I have been looking for the man who left that envelope for 22 years. She said, "When I find him, he will be the story, not me." He sat on it for 3 weeks. He went back to the funerals on his own on 2 different Fridays. He watched families. He watched the specific moment when a grief-stunned widow or a barely holding together adult child found a white envelope under a seat. On the second Friday, he watched a man, young father, 3 children under 10, find an envelope and open it and sit back down in the empty pew and put his hands over his face and stay there for a long time. Daniel sat 4 rows forward. He understood what Naomi meant about the conversation she was trying to have. He went back to his editor, said the story he had been working on had not panned out. He moved on to other assignments. But he kept the notebook. 3 weeks later, he got a tip about a funeral that Friday. A well-loved figure in the community. Large service. The tip said it was worth covering for the community angle. Daniel arrived early. He was sitting 4 rows from the back when Naomi came in. She took her seat. The service began. He was watching the family at the front when he saw a man in the 3rd row turn around. The man's eyes moved to the back of the church. Found Naomi. He stood up. The service stopped. He pointed at her, said, loudly enough that the entire church heard, "You were there when my father died." The church went completely still. 200 people. Every head turned toward the back row. Naomi did not run. She sat completely still, the envelope in her lap. The man, Marcus Mensa, walked down the aisle toward her. He stopped at the end of her row. His expression carried something between accusation and something more complicated. The specific expression of a man who has been carrying a question for 8 months and has just found the person he believes has the answer. He said, "My father, Arthur Mensa. He died 8 months ago." He said, "You were not at his funeral. I would have seen you." He said, "I saw you last year at Riverside General Hospital, room 414, the week before he died." He said, "You sat beside him for an hour. You held his hand. You left before he woke up." He said, "I came back into the room and the nurse said a woman had been there. She described you." He said, "I have been looking for you since then." He said, "Who are you? And why were you there with my father?" The 200 people in that church waited. Naomi stood up. She walked to the end of the pew. She stood in front of Marcus Mensa, and she told him the same story she had told Daniel. But this time, the whole church heard it. The bench, the envelope, the man who walked away, The 22 years of searching, the community record she had finally found, the photograph she had matched to the face she had been carrying in her memory, the drive to Riverside General, room 414, the hour beside the bed of a man whose name she had finally learned. She said, "I do not know if he heard me." She said, "I told him what that morning meant, what his envelope paid for, what it allowed my daughter to become." She said, "I told him I had spent 22 years trying to find a way to say thank you." She said, "And I told him I was sorry it had taken me so long." The church was silent. Marcus stood in the aisle, his jaw working, his eyes doing something that had no clean name. After a long moment, he said, he kept a photograph. He said, under his bed, in a box with his important things. He said, a photograph of a woman on a bench, a baby strapped to her chest, a white envelope beside her on the seat. He said, I found it when we were clearing his things. I didn't know what it meant. He looked at Naomi. He said, that was you. She said, that was me. He said, he kept it for 22 years. She said, he wanted to know we were all right. Marcus sat down in the nearest pew, not because he was asked to, because his legs needed somewhere to go. The white envelope Naomi had been carrying was still in her hand. She looked at it. Then she placed it on the pew beside Marcus. She said, this was for your family today. It was going to be anonymous, like all the others. She said, I did not know whose funeral this was until I walked in and saw his photograph on the order of service. She said, I have walked into 142 funerals. She said, and his was the 143rd. Marcus looked at the envelope. He said, why? Why are you still doing this? You found him. You said what you needed to say. Why keep going? Naomi thought about it, said, because the man who saved me did not save only me. She said, he started something. That morning on the bench. He started something that I've been trying to continue every Friday for 3 years. She said, I do not know how long I will do it. She said, I just know that every Friday there is somewhere I need to be. Daniel had heard everything from 4 rows back. He waited until the service ended and the church began to empty. He approached Naomi outside on the pavement. He said, I am still not going to write it. She looked at him. He said, the man you found did not leave his name. He said, if he had wanted the world to know, he would have left his name. She said, you found this story. Any other journalist would publish it. He said, I know. He said, but I watched a man find an envelope 3 weeks ago and sit with his hands over his face for 5 minutes. He said, I thought about publishing then too. He said, and I thought about how the man who put the envelope there chose not to put his name on it. He said, I think he knew something about what it means to give a thing completely. He said, without keeping any of it for yourself. Naomi looked at him, said, you would have been a good journalist if you had published this. He said, I am a better person for not. She laughed. The first time in the story she had laughed. He said, what happens now? She said, next Friday I will go to a funeral. I will sit at the back. I will leave an envelope. I will walk out before anyone asks who I am. He said, and Marcus? She said, he called me yesterday. She said, he wants to come with me next Friday. She said, he wants to understand what his father saw that morning on the bench. Daniel looked at her, said, what did his father see? She said, a woman who needed help. She said, that was all. He did not calculate whether she deserved it. He did not weigh the risk. He did not check whether it was practical. She said, he just sat down and he helped. She said, that was it. That was the whole thing. She started walking. He stood on the pavement and watched her go. Then he took out his notebook. He wrote 1 line. He never published the story, but he kept the line. It said, the hardest thing in the world is to help someone without keeping any of it for yourself. Naomi's daughter Grace was 22 years old. She had grown up knowing her mother went somewhere every Friday. She had never asked where. Some things about parents you sense are private, and you honor the privacy because you trust the person. She found out the same week as everyone else. Not from Daniel, from Marcus. He drove to the university, asked if he could meet with her. She sat across from him in a coffee shop near campus. He placed a photograph on the table, a photograph from a box under his father's bed, a woman on a bench, a baby strapped to her chest, a white envelope on the bench beside her. Grace looked at the photograph. She understood immediately who the woman was. She said, "How old is she here?" Marcus said, 22. Grace looked at the photograph for a long time. She was looking at herself in the only way you can see yourself before you existed, through the eyes of someone who almost did not make it to the morning you were born into. She said, "She never told me." Marcus said, "She did not want you to feel like you owed anyone anything." Grace said, "But she spent 22 years repaying it herself." She picked up the photograph. She held it carefully, the way you hold something that is both ordinary and the most important object you have ever touched. She drove home that weekend. She walked into the kitchen. Her mother was at the counter with her back to the door. She said, "Mama." Naomi turned around. Grace held up the photograph. Naomi looked at it. She had not seen it before. She had not known Arthur had kept it. She looked at the photograph for a long time, at herself, 22 years old, on the bench, with everything ahead of her that she could not yet see. Grace said, "Why did you not tell me?" Naomi said, "Because I did not want your life to begin with a debt." She said, "You were 11 days old. You did not owe anyone anything." Grace said, "But you took on the debt yourself." Naomi said, "It was not a debt." She said, "It was a conversation I needed to finish." Grace said, "It has been 22 years." Naomi said, "Some conversations take a long time." Grace walked to her mother. She took her hand, said, "Tell me about him. Tell me about James. Tell me about the bench. Tell me about all of it." They sat at the kitchen table until midnight. Naomi talked. Grace listened, the way she had listened every Sunday on the phone, completely without interruption. At the end, Grace said, "He saved my life before I knew I had one." Naomi said, "Yes." Grace said, "I want to go with you on Friday." Naomi looked at her daughter, 22 years old, the age Naomi had been on the bench. She said, "Next Friday, Marcus is coming." Grace said, "Then there will be 3 of us. The following Friday, a church on the east side of the city. 3 people arrived together and sat at the back. A woman in her 40s, a man in his 40s, and a young woman in her early 20s. They did not know the people at the front. They sat through the service. At the end, Naomi placed a white envelope under the seat. She stood. Marcus stood beside her. Grace stood on her other side. They walked out together. On the pavement outside, Grace reached over and took her mother's hand, the way Arthur Menser had placed an envelope on a bench beside a woman he did not know, without ceremony, without expectation, just present when presence was what was needed. The wall in Naomi's office had 15 photographs now. Arthur Menser's was in the center. Naomi had added it herself the day after the funeral. She had written beneath it in her careful handwriting, "Arthur Menser, the one who started it all." The photograph was not from the community record. It was the photograph from the box under his bed, the one where he was not at a podium or at a formal event or posing for a portrait, the one where he was simply walking down a street, away from a bench, an ordinary man in an ordinary moment, not knowing that the moment was anything at all. 22 years ago, a man sat beside a stranger. He did not ask her name. He did not wait to be thanked. He placed an envelope on a bench and walked away. He had no way of knowing that the woman on that bench would spend 22 years trying to find him. He had no way of knowing that she would attend 143 funerals, that she would find families standing where she once stood and make sure they knew someone was there, that his son would one day sit at the back of a church beside the woman his father had helped and begin to understand who his father actually was, that a young woman would one day hold a photograph of herself as a baby and a mother who almost did not make it and understand that the life she was living had started on a bench with a stranger's envelope and a decision that cost one man something and gave everything to someone else. Arthur Menser never thought of it as something significant. He thought of it as what you do when you see someone who needs help and you happen to have something that could help them. Just that, and just that, turned out to be everything. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video and subscribe to Turning Point Tales. We will see you in the next one.